you for joining us for today's Ipsos Inside Track webinar series featuring data and trends shaping the 2022 midterm elections. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Chris Jackson, a seasoned political pollster and Senior Vice President of Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our final pre-election version of our Inside Track webinar, where we cover all of the latest and greatest of the Ipsos public opinion data that we have collected. As Ellen said, please don't hesitate to use that Q&A function to log questions, and I will certainly try to reserve as much time as possible at the end of the webinar to go through those questions, answer them. And as always, if you do come up with a question after the fact, certainly welcome to send us a note. We're always happy to chat. So we have a pretty busy agenda today. We have a lot of data to go through. We've been doing a lot of research recently, so let's just dive right in. The agenda will seem somewhat familiar. We're going to talk about the main issues, sort of the landscape for America. Then we're going to dig into a number of those issues based on recent polling we've done over the last month. And then we'll turn to the elections and what to sort of expect over the next 2 weeks as we close in on the midterms. And then I want to end up with a little bit of a few minutes to talk about, can we trust the polls in 2022, and actually show you some data from our 538 election tracking series that I think provides a little bit more insight into that question than the just sort of honestly speculation you might have seen out in the media. I think fundamentally, yes, we can. Probably not surprised there. And then again, opening it up for questions at the end. So let's get started. The main issue landscape. So it's not really changed. We are seeing in America that looks very similar now to where it did earlier this year, certainly as far back as May. Issues such as inflation or increasing costs continues to be the dominant issue for Americans. This is from our 538 series. You can see 55% of Americans saying inflation or increasing costs are their number one worry. Unchanged from last month and virtually unchanged all year. Political extremism and polarization and crime or gun violence make up the second tier of issues, also both essentially unchanged. Climate change, 21%, sort of that next level down, third tier issue. That's unchanged from last month, though it has increased a little bit from earlier this year. And then there's a whole range of other topics that are concerns for Americans, but concerns for relatively small slices of the population. And many of these issues are the issues that we see as actually important in the election, and I'll actually talk about why that's the case a little bit later when we get into our election section. But it's interesting to note how, despite the media news, the media landscape, sort of all the churn that we see in discussion of politics, the truth is the concerns of Americans have been very robust, very stable over this year. It's the economy and costs first. It's sort of political extremism and personal safety second, and then a number of other issues sort of third behind that. The only significant mover we see is actually COVID-19, the coronavirus, the pandemic, continues to slide as a concern as Americans continue to move past any sort of significant sense of worry about the pandemic, even if COVID hasn't totally moved past us yet. And if we ask the question in different ways, we see fundamentally similar data. Now, you can ask about people's concerns or issues in any number of ways. Here we are asking from our Reuters Core Political series what Joe Biden should prioritize. Here too, we see the economy as the number one issue, 55% by far, employment and jobs sort of following that. And then into those sort of more political topics like immigration, the environment, things like that. And if we sort of shift the focus from President Biden, what he should be focusing on, to what is driving your vote, we see basically the same rank ordering of issues: the inflation, prices at the top, economy, and then again, going into some of those more political concerns and sort of that next tier. So very clear message from the American public: the economy, the economy, the economy. What's going on with prices and inflation? That's the main concern for the large chunk of the population. So let's go into some of those issues at more depth. And let's start off with the economy, since it is that main issue. This is our Ipsos consumer confidence index. I've shared this with you in the past. This is our time series going back to 2002 every month, and then since the pandemic started, every 2 weeks. We've been tracking it since consumer sentiment has been pretty wild over the pandemic period. And what we see recently is consumer sentiment has been relatively stable after a little bit of a roller coaster this summer when we saw some dips about the same time we saw gas prices spiking. Over the last 2 or 3 months, it's been relatively flat, right around 50 on the index score. 50 doesn't really mean anything, but it is just below sort of the average, the historical average. So it essentially is sort of saying that Americans are kind of meh about the economy writ large. They're not negative. They're not certainly as bad as they were during the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, but they're also not feeling great about the economy like they were in 2019 or early 2020 before the pandemic hit, or even like they were feeling in the summer of 2021 once everyone thought the vaccines are going to sort of, take care of the pandemic and inflation hadn't really kicked in yet. So we're seeing a little bit of stability in how Americans are feeling about the economy, even as we do continue to see a lot of sort of noise and sort of the news system about economic signals being kind of all over the place. And what we're seeing is stability in sort of two key facets of the economy, and that is people's job security. We're seeing people's job securities remaining somewhat robust, certainly not, again, as great as it was last summer, but not bad, right? About 50% of Americans say that they feel comfortable about their job security. At the same time, we're seeing relatively few Americans saying that they feel comfortable with their ability to afford their households. And this is essentially our best measure of sort of those inflationary pressures. And you can see that's been relatively stable at about 35%, about a third of Americans saying that they're comfortable there. And it's those sort of two countervailing pressures, right? That sort of job security, sort of keeping things somewhat stable, in price pessimism that's sort of pulling things down. And that's the overwhelming factor of how people are viewing the economy right now. And until one of those two changes, we're probably not going to see a lot of change in overall consumer sentiment. Now, they could move either way, right? Inflation could ease, people could feel better about their ability to afford household items, and then we'd probably see this overall consumer sentiment improve, or maybe the job market weakens, as some signals have suggested it might, and we could see this number fall off even more. But these are sort of the two push-pull factors that are really driving the economy right now and have been driving the economy really for the last several months. And we can see that American consumers are starting to move from that concern about inflation being very dominant to a little bit more concern about job security moving forward. This is from, again, our consumer confidence tracker. We can see that, again, the majority of Americans still expect inflation to exist, to pressure, but we're starting to see the ratio of inflation versus people worried about jobs and unemployment starting to equalize a little bit. And I think this is, again, a testament to a lot of the news, a lot of the sort of the conversation that's been out there about the potential for a recession, about sort of what the impact of a long-term cooling will be for the economy, or even interest rate raises might be for the economy. So we're seeing a little bit of that movement, even if we're not necessarily seeing people expressing large-scale job loss in any way, shape, or form. That's sort of where the concern is starting to move to. Shifting gears to the conflict in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. Recently, after Russian President Putin illegally annexed several regions of Ukraine, he then sort of intimated that he would be willing to use nuclear weapons to defend that territory. So we asked recently how Americans feel about these concerns. And what we find is that most Americans, there is a relatively decent level of worry, of concern about the possibility of a nuclear war. Not a majority, certainly, of Americans, but a decent number, just over half, saying that they are worried about it, afraid of the possibility of that happening, thinking that it's a potential something that's going to happen. However, that does not really change Americans' views towards our position in Ukraine. We do still see large majorities of Americans saying that we should support the Ukrainian side, that we should be providing them with weapons, that we should be providing them keeping up diplomatic efforts, sort of pressure on Russia. Very few Americans, of course, saying that they support sending American troops to the conflict, which has been the case since the beginning, but a clear sense among America that we should have a strong position in opposition to using nuclear weapons, or in response to if they are used. So not necessarily sort of shrinking violence with the American people, at least not at this time early on. We are seeing support for Ukraine continuing to be very high, even as it has sort of slid from the headlines a little bit. Shifting gears again, as I mentioned, concern about the pandemic has declined over the last several months. However, we are seeing awareness and concern about mental health increasing. And I think this is a testament to people sort of reassessing where their lives are after 2 years of the pandemic, after they're essentially kind of getting back to normal to some extent, reckoning with sort of what that impact has been on them, on their families, on their friends, of those 2 years of uncertainty, of fear, of isolation for some people. And we're seeing both in the United States and globally an increase in the number of people who are concerned about mental health. This is from a recent Ipsos Global Health Monitor survey, tracking sort of these levels of concern over time. And in this survey, we see some relatively worrying data points, particularly the one at the bottom where we see almost a quarter of people in the United States or around the world considered self-harm at least once in the last year, with a smaller minority, about 10%, saying that they consider that at least several times in the last year. And this is, I think, again, a testament to the stress people have felt over the last few years. You can certainly see that in the first data point, where the majority of people report that they have felt stressed in their daily lives on a relatively regular basis. So, this is, again, I think, a testament to a lot of the struggles we've dealt with coming through and out of the pandemic. And I think it also is a contributing factor to a lot of the other sort of behaviors we're seeing out there, including sort of some of the extreme political behaviors, including sort of the people sort of acting a little bit wacky in sort of public forums. It's this sort of stress that's sort of built up over the last 2 years, finding a way, maybe an inappropriate way, but a way to express itself. Different topic, and maybe a way to deal with stress. We do find that Americans are actually broadly supportive of President Biden's cannabis reforms that he announced a few weeks ago. This is, I think, a case of the president actually kind of leading from behind. We have seen over the last 2 decades American attitudes towards cannabis and marijuana moving strongly in a permissive direction, where Americans are generally viewing marijuana as not that big of a deal, not that dangerous. And we see that certainly here, where majorities of Americans, super majorities of Americans, are essentially agreeing with Biden's moves, including changing how marijuana is classified so it's not a Schedule I drug, pardoning or forgiving prior federal convictions of marijuana, and releasing people who have been convicted for marijuana possession. We also see a majority, 68%, saying that they support the idea of governors pardoning state-level convictions for marijuana possessions, which are the majority of these sort of arrests and incarcerations. So again, overwhelming majority, but there are some pretty strong partisan differences, particularly on that last one. We do see a minority of Republicans versus a majority of independents and Democrats supporting it. That suggests this could be the kind of thing we see in the next 2 weeks as a political wedge issue, with Democratic governors or gubernatorial candidates talking about how they would do this, potentially in opposition to Republicans who may be a little bit more opposed, a little bit more law and order, though you do see a little bit of a mixed bag. For instance, Republican Senate candidate Matt Oz in Pennsylvania said that he supports some of these marijuana reforms. So it's not necessarily a grab bag. It's not necessarily a slam dunk that Republicans are going to oppose in all facets, but it is, generally speaking, a relatively popular move. Another issue that's been up recently, the final January 6th committee hearing occurred last week. I think that was last week. And this is the last time this committee will be meeting before the election, potentially the last time this committee will be meeting at all. They did subpoena Trump to testify. We'll see if that actually happens. But if Republicans take control of the Congress, as we sort of expect them to do in 2023, they will probably disband this committee, and it will be done. Its work will be done. So what do we see? Well, we see that American opinion on Trump and his involvement in the January 6th events have really not moved much over the last 6 months, over essentially the lifespan of this committee. We still see a majority of Americans believe that Trump is responsible, at least partially to blame, for the January 6th riot. We see a majority of Americans who disagree that the election was stolen from Trump. And we see a majority of Americans saying that Trump should not run again in 2024. However, it's important to note just how big the partisan differences are on all of these questions. We have Republicans, essentially the majority of Republicans in sort of the opposition on each one of these items. That's essentially the dynamic that is governing Republican politics right now, where even if the majority of the country is sort of going one way, and this includes Democrats and independents, Republicans are so strong the other way, that's going to dominate the direction that they go, particularly sort of this support for Trump running for re-election, that 51%, which is not as strong as it was maybe a few years ago, but is still stronger than we see for just about any other Republican candidate. But the January 6th hearings themselves have not had a huge impact. We've not seen a big change in any of these numbers over the last 6 months. This is, again, from our Reuters series. We've been tracking these same questions since May, since the committee began their proceedings. And then finally, looking at the election that's actually going to happen in a few weeks, we did a survey recently with Axios in our Two Americas series, where we asked people how likely they thought it would be that voter fraud would contribute to their side losing the election. And we see a worrying number of Americans willing to entertain that thought. So again, we asked Democrats, if the Democratic Party doesn't win control of Congress, do you think that's due to election fraud? Same thing, Republicans. If Republicans don't control Congress, is that due to election fraud? And we see that a minority of Democrats, 18%, and a slightly larger minority of Republicans, 27%, say that they think it's likely. But I think equally concerning is the number of people saying not sure. This essentially suggests that this is a group of people who are not confident enough in the system to think that it's not going to happen, that it's unlikely. And I think that's really sort of the challenge that the administration, that really sort of all of American government faces right now, is this very low level of confidence that government is behaving in sort of an honest and transparent fashion, particularly among the Republican Party, where you see only a minority, 41%, say that it is unlikely that fraud contributed to their losses if that were to happen. So a little bit of a worrying sign going into the elections in 2 weeks. All right, speaking of elections, let's dig in. Just want to sort of just brief folks a little bit with sort of what's going on, what's sort of up on the ballot this year. In the House of Representatives, of course, all 435 seats are up for re-election. The term for a House of Representatives seat is only 2 years, so they're all up every 2 years. However, because of gerrymandering, because of how districts are drawn, the truth is most of those districts, most of those 435, are safe for the Republican or the Democratic side. And there are probably only about 25, 24 plus or minus a handful, that are actually competitive races that we don't really know what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks. A mention of a couple of those: Colorado 8, Florida 27, Nebraska 2, which is Omaha, New Hampshire 1, New York 19, Pennsylvania 1 and 17, which is sort of Pennsylvania, Philly suburbs, and Pennsylvania sort of Pittsburgh suburbs sort of area. These are the races that are the closest, where they'll probably be sort of the bellwether, some of the ones to maybe watch on election night if you're following election returns for how things are going to go. And the experts think, and Ipsos thinks, that the most likely outcome is that Republicans are going to take control from the Democratic Party of the House of Representatives, probably by a relatively small margin, but still, that's probably what's going to happen. In the Senate, only a third of the Senate seats are up for election. Senate terms are 6 years, so it's only every 2 years, only a third are up, the way they're sort of staggered. Right now, the Senate, of course, chamber is divided 50-50, and of those 35 seats, only 10 are really sort of considered to be somewhat competitive, and even that 10 is, maybe a little bit of stretching the envelope. It's probably a smaller number that are truly competitive races. Some of the interesting ones: Nevada, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. We'll get to in a few minutes, and our view of that is a toss-up. And then gubernatorial mansions. Governors are elected for 4 years. However, the timing of the governor's races is a little bit random across the country. 39 are set up to happen in the midterm. The rest happen either off cycle or during the presidential year. Of those, again, there's about 10 or 11 that are competitive, and it's really kind of the same states that we see as potentially competitive in the Senate races. And then just due to which gubernatorial seats are up, we probably think the Democratic Party is going to take a few more gubernatorial mansions this year than they had at the start of the year, but it's not going to be a significant shift. So this is something similar to what you've seen before, showing the number of seats gained or lost by the party in power. So that's essentially the party that controls the White House in each election. And I think it's, and I've showed you this as a scatter plot before. Here it is in terms of just the number of seats. And it's just good to note that the only time that the party in power picked up seats in the House was in 1998, when Bill Clinton was pretty popular after a strong economy and the kind of disaster of the Republican Lewinsky-based impeachment proceedings, and then George Bush in 2002 in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, when his popularity was sky high. There has not really been any other instance where we've seen an incumbent president's party gain seats in the House. And I think that's just something to keep in mind, thinking about what the Democrats are facing this year, that the average loss is 26 seats for the incumbent party. We think it's probably going to be a little bit on the lower side of that, maybe in the 13 to 26 range, but still, that's sort of what the Democratic Party is facing. These are sort of the historical gravity in elections. Now, the Senate's a little bit messier. As I mentioned before, there's definitely been numerous instances of the party in power picking up Senate seats, including in 2018, when Trump sort of got, the Republicans rather, sort of got really beat up in the House, ended up actually picking up 2 Senate seats. Partially that's due to which Senate seats are up at a particular time, but also the idiosyncrasies of those specific campaigns. So the Senate's a little bit messier, a little bit harder to predict going into the election. So the issue landscape. So I mentioned earlier that those sort of third tier issues that aren't necessarily dominant nationally can be very important for the election. And this slide shows why. What we're seeing here is all Americans from that same set of data that I showed you at the very beginning, but then the 20% or so of Americans who make up Democratic likely voters, and the 20% or so that make up Republican likely voters, and what their issue hierarchy is. And you can see among Democratic and Republican voters, it's very different, right? So among Democrats, you see a lot more of these second tier issues like climate change, race, abortion, rising to the fore, in addition to political extremism, of course, as sort of the number one issue. And the interpretation of this is essentially fear of Republicans, the political extremism. That's how Democrats are really thinking about it, is just fear of Republicans. Then for the Republican Party, inflation, of course, is the number one issue, though with Republicans, inflation is really a cudgel to beat the Biden administration. It's really seen as a way to attack the administration, not as a thing that's happening to the economy, but a failure of the Democratic president. And then beyond that, we also see, again, some of these sort of third tier issues rising to much higher prominence with Republican likely voters, including immigration, including budget deficit, including election security or fraud. This is sort of the big lie that Trump lost, or the election rather was stolen from Trump. Significant numbers of Republicans concerned about that, even though, again, it's a relatively niche issue for the public at large. So this is why you see some of these very sort of weird niche issues that the public as a whole don't care about that much driving the election, because among these narrower slices of the public that are going to vote, they're much more important. So this is just looking at the issue matchups. You've seen this data. I've showed this to you in the past, but basically right now, Americans view Republicans as stronger on the economy, Democrats stronger on social issues. You can probably see this reflected from the last slide, that this is sort of why Republicans are more interested in the economy a little bit and Democrats more on social issues. But this is the landscape right now. And I think the fact that Republicans are seen as stronger on the economy is one of the reasons that they sort of have a little bit more of an advantage this year, even though, again, it's a little bit split because the economy, even with independents, is still the dominant issue for Americans writ large. The other piece of sort of political gravity, as it were, is President Biden's approval rating. It remains relatively weak at 40% in our Reuters Ipsos core political tracking polling. It has been pretty stable over the summer, not really getting beyond 39 to about 42%. We are a little lower than some other polls who have met like 41 to 43%, but either way, this is not a terribly great showing, certainly not showing of overwhelming support. It is relatively similar to where Trump was in 2018. So we're seeing sort of similar political dynamics playing out at that sort of the presidential level, and I think it remains open to see how that sort of plays out at the congressional and Senate level. But you can see sort of Biden's approval rating, particularly sort of is going up and down with gas prices and sort of some of the inflationary pressures. He reached his sort of worst point earlier this summer when gas prices were, of course, peaking at $5 a gallon in some places. Recently, we did some research with Latino Americans. This is from a Washington Post Latino registered voter survey we did recently. And I think there's a couple of things that are important to take away from that. One is that if you remember the states that we think are most interesting or most competitive, many of them are Sunbelt states: Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina. These are all states where the Latino vote actually is probably going to have a significant impact. And what we see here is that while the Latino community does generally, Latino registered voters do generally lean Democratic more often than not, on issues of the economy, on issues of rising prices, there's much more parity between the Republican and Democratic Party. And this is, I think, again, one of the challenges Democrats are facing is with Latinos worried about the economy, worried about price pressures. Are they able to make the case effectively to them that the Democratic Party will do something about that, will help alleviate that, or will Republicans essentially be able to benefit from being sort of the party, the solution, as it will, even if they may not have solutions? This is, I think, the real challenge as that Democrats are facing as we go into the last 2 weeks of the election, is turning out these voters in those Sunbelt states, and that I think will make the difference, because in many ways, this group of Latino Americans is becoming something of a swing bloc, a swing electorate, because they don't have necessarily the same tight identification with either side that you see, for instance, in like white Republicans or in Black American voters as well. This is actually the congressional ballot, and you can see that Democrats are doing better than Republicans all in all on that. So among all Hispanics, this is with registered voters again, about a 2-to-1 ratio, Democratic to Republican. That's actually a little worse than Democrats did in 2018 with this cohort. So this does represent Republicans improving slightly, but I think it's just important to remember that, you know, for the most part, Democrats are still winning the Latino vote. They're just not winning it by the same kind of margin that they used to. And I think that, again, is sort of the big challenge facing the Democratic Party, or the opportunity potentially for Republicans. I want to skip over this because this data actually is a little out of date, September, as you can see, and the next iteration of this is actually coming out tomorrow. So I definitely encourage you to stay tuned. It'll be our 538 Ipsos poll. You'll be able to find it on 538.com. So please stay tuned for that. But it basically just shows Republicans have had a little bit of an enthusiasm advantage over the last couple of months versus Democrats. Likewise, in the generic congressional ballot, it has been very close over the last few months. But what I really wanted to get to is this next slide. And I know this is a little bit of an eye chart. It's a little bit hard to follow. So let me sort of unpack what this is to you a little bit. But what this is built to do is to speak to a lot of that sort of noise you may have seen in the media ecosystem about polls changing and about one side winning and one side losing, and then like momentum shifts and all this kind of crazy stuff, which honestly I don't think is real. The truth is most of that is a result of response bias issues, where essentially who's answering the phone, metaphorically speaking sometimes, and not actual change in behavior. So what this is from our 538 series. Remember, our 538 poll is a panel study where we are talking to the same Americans every month over time. And what we've done is showing you the opinions of these same Americans at 3 points in time: May, July, and then September. And then we sort of divided them up into these different groups where we have Biden non-voters. These are people who voted for Biden in 2020 but aren't planning to vote this year. Democratic voters, so these are essentially the people who say they're going to vote, are certain to vote Democratic this year. Non-voters, these are people who didn't vote in 2020, say they're not going to vote in this year. Swing voters, these are people who voted one way for one side in 2020 and say that they plan to vote for the other side this year. So Biden to Republican voters or Trump to Democratic voters. And then Republican voters and Trump non-voters are basically the inverse of the ones we were just talking about. So what this shows, though, is again with that within individual change over time. And what's noteworthy is how little movement there is from the Democratic blocks at the top to the Republican blocks at the bottom, or to those swing voter groups. It's less than a percentage point moving from wave to wave within individual, right? So these are people who are changing their mind about who they're going to support. 3%, 4% of Americans are swing voters. They're relatively few. There's very few people moving from one side to the other. And indeed, most of the movement that's actually happening is between the voting and non-voting partisans on each side. So it's Biden non-voters to Democratic voters, it's Republican voters to Trump non-voters, and vice versa. So most of the movement we're seeing in the election isn't some sort of moderate middle that's sort of trying to decide who they want to vote for and like considering both sides. It's partisans deciding if they're going to vote or not. And then that large block of non-voters who just don't, they're not following the election, they're not really into it, they're not paying a lot of attention. And that's not really changing. This is really what America actually looks like as it comes to the election. So we see all of this noise about, you know, oh, the Republicans are gaining, the Democrats are losing ground, and the polls lately. I mean, maybe that's true, but honestly, what's more likely to be happening is we're seeing some of this movement between Democratic voters and Biden non-voters, essentially Democratic voters being maybe a little demoralized, being less likely to be answering the phone, less likely to talk to interviewers. And at the same time, we're seeing Republican voters being a little bit enthusiastic, a little bit more likely to answer the phone. And that's causing the numbers to sort of bounce around, even as the reality has been very stable over the last 6 months. So what do we think is going to happen? So the House, we think, still going to go to the Republicans, not by a large margin. You can see from these various experts that the average is, again, 25 seats. And Republicans don't even have a majority that people think they're certain to win, 214 versus the 218 that they need. So thinking that Republicans are probably going to end up in the 225 to 235 range and their level of control. Still the majority, and that's all you really need, but not an overwhelming majority necessarily. However, there is a lot of these races that are very close. So it is possible that Republicans gain most of those 25 seats that are available, that are toss-ups, and maybe even a couple that weren't considered toss-ups could go their direction. So, you know, there is very thin margins. So even though it's only 25 seats that are available, it's not like the most likely outcome is 50-50. It's a very flat sort of bell curve where the odds of Republicans gaining 15 seats and the odds of Republicans gaining 25 seats are relatively close to each other. Same for the Democrats. Theoretically, it's possible for the Democrats to take all of those toss-up seats and win the majority. We just don't think it's very likely. The Senate, again, the Senate races, pretty interesting, pretty competitive, very close. I think, you know, we'll need to watch these. Georgia has moved a little bit from being very close to a little bit more Democratic friendly after some of the news with Herschel Walker paying for a woman's abortion came out and his son attacking him. However, those kind of events tend to have a relatively short half-life. So we'll need to keep watching to see if that sort of maintains or if it goes back to that very close 50-50 margin. Ohio is right now showing as a close election, but we think it's probably going to be a little bit more Republican. It's a state that's trended Republican. Likewise, Florida, state that's trending Republican. But the races that we think are most closest and the ones that most bear watching is Nevada, is Wisconsin, and is Georgia. We think those are the races that are going to be the closest and the most competitive to watch and keep track on. And then the gubernatorial races, we do see a lot of really interesting races, but I think the rule of thumb is that an incumbent, chances are, is going to win. We see this basically across the board. In most places, the incumbents have advantages. The only places that isn't true is in Kansas, where a Democratic incumbent governor has only a relatively small margin. Kansas is typically a pretty Republican state, so she's actually outperforming sort of the fundamentals there to have a small lead. And then Nevada, which is very much a toss-up, could go either way, and Wisconsin, also a toss-up, could go either way. Two very close states, states with very closely aligned electorates, very small margins between them, could really go either way. So we're basically in the same place we've been most of the year. We expect the Republicans to make some gains this year, particularly in the House, where we expect them to take control. The Senate could go either way. It's very much remains a toss-up. I don't want to overstate any certainty about what's going to happen. I do think that's going to be very close. Yeah, and sort of the governor's mansions, also a little bit of a toss-up, a little bit of a could probably a split either way, all in all. And the outcome of this is going to be essentially a government that doesn't really get a lot done over the next 2 years. There's going to be a lot of sort of deadlock between the Republican House and the White House, and maybe the Democratic or Republican-controlled Senate. There's certainly not going to be enough to override any vetoes if Republicans do take both chambers. So a lot of legislative gridlock, and probably a lot of noise, a lot of posturing. A lot of investigations coming from the Republican-controlled chambers. All right, so finally, I want to talk a little bit about, can we trust the polls? Been a cottage industry since 2016, 2020. We see a slate of them recently. And I want to share some data with you, again, from this 538 series. Now, because we interviewed 2,000 people in our first survey, and we keep going back to those same 2,000 people, however, all 2,000 of them do not answer each of our follow-up waves. We've seen about 75% answer those follow-up waves, and we can look at who is and is not answering each of those follow-up surveys as a little bit of an indicator of what sort of response or non-response biases may exist in surveys, right? Because these are essentially the people that it may be harder to reach in a more typical survey. We're just sort of going out with a unique population. So this is the percentage of each group that participates in each of the follow-up surveys. And you can see on the first chart that by race ethnicity, minority Americans, particularly Hispanic or Black Americans, are much less likely to be in the follow-up waves than white, Asian, Native American, or multiracial Americans who are more likely, And if that were true, we'd actually expect polls to be understating Democrats slightly. However, if you look at this middle chart, you see actually Republicans, who are the red line, even though it shows yellow in the grid, sorry for that, are actually a little bit less likely to be taking part. So it is a little bit more, even though we're seeing Black and Hispanics less likely to be in the survey follow-up waves, also Republicans. So some contrasting factors or forces going in there. And then this last one I think is actually really interesting, because what we see here is that Fox News consumers aren't actually any less likely to be in the survey than anyone else. It's actually people who consume no major news media or primarily social media based news are the ones that are more likely to drop out. So it's not the Fox News crowd necessarily that is missing out in surveys. It might be more the QAnon crowd. So again, another look at this data, and this is, I think, where it gets to be particularly interesting. If we look at this by our voter segments, we can see actually the Republican voting and Democratic voting blocks are actually equally likely to be in the survey, 84 to 83%. Now, these are the people who are certain voters. Indeed, in August, actually, the Democratic bloc was actually a little underrepresented relative to where the Republicans were. However, it is the Trump sort of non-Republican voting this year block is much less likely to be in the survey. So these are essentially people who voted for Trump in 2020, but aren't going to vote Republican this year, aren't enthused about the Republican this year. This, to my speaking, is sort of the core of sort of that very Trump-allied MAGA sort of population. And you can see this again in a different way by this opinion of Donald Trump slide next to it, where the people who are very favorable towards Donald Trump are also among some of the least likely to be in it. So it's not necessarily sort of your Fox News viewing Republican that's missing from a survey, right? It is people who are maybe more peripheral involved in the election system, but are very loyal to Donald Trump, very sort of personally attached to Donald Trump. Those are the people that we might be struggling to reach. And what that says is that some of the problems that we had in 2020 and 2016 might not be present this year because, again, those Republicans that are more typical Republicans, more sort of rank and file voting in midterm type Republicans are still present in surveys, even if that Trump base is not. And indeed, we actually see this in our data. This is looking at, again, this time series by a couple of different indicators. And if you look, our first wave of data, Republicans had a 2-point advantage on our generic congressional ballot. And this is without any weights. And then by the fifth wave, due to sort of who was and was not in the survey, it actually moved from a Republican advantage to a tie, and the people who were not present in the survey were actually more likely to be Republican voters than not. But remember, we always weight our surveys before we publish that. And we at Ipsos have started using a past vote weight to account for some of these political dimensions. And when we do that, we actually see our number that we published go from that tie to a 3-point Republican advantage. So we're actually seeing a little bit of an overcorrection in the Republicans' favor in our poll data once we apply that weight. So what that means to me, what I take away from that is that, yes, there are some populations that polls are struggling to reach, but we actually do have some tools that exist to us that allow us to fix it, that allow us to correct for that, much like we have used for years to account for non-response in minority populations or less affluent populations, which have been problems for the research community for decades. It's just we're now having to figure out how to apply that to a new domain, politics, and having to figure out what the right measure is to weight on, given that there's not, census data on political leanings. So that is, I think, the real sort of thing that we're working to figure out in this election. But we here at Ipsos, we're using how people say they voted in 2020 for the president as that weight. It seems to be having a pretty solid impact, doing a lot of correcting our numbers pretty well to where we think it should be. All right, so that is all I have for you today. Good, I did keep 15 minutes for questions. So like always, this data is publicly available. It'll be up on our website shortly, as will a recording of this webinar. And yeah, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A box in the application, the meeting application, and let's see what we got. All right, re-support for Ukraine, any change or drop since Minority Leader McCarthy indicated Republicans would potentially cut funding if they won the House? No, not particularly. I don't think that news has really sunk in broadly across the country, that piece of information. We do already see that Republicans are less supportive of Ukraine than Democrats or independents are. And I think that would probably continue if Republicans did take control of the House of Representatives. But I think until you see sort of a major Republican figure sort of loudly sort of changing their position like Donald Trump, you're probably not going to see a lot of movement based on sort of members of the House making public pronouncements on the topic. How much of the increase in concern about mental health is due to mass shootings and people talking about the impact, how gun shootings are mental health issues? That's a good question. That's not one that we've actually studied it directly. We do know that when we ask surveys immediately after mass shootings, Republicans are much more likely to say that it's a mental health issue than it is an access to gun issue or a access to gun issue, basically. But I don't know if we've tried to connect that to these more large-term trends in the population about concerns about mental health. I think that's a good question. That's something that we should definitely dig into. Was the question about voter fraud only, or was there a voter suppression question included as well? We didn't, in this particular survey, ask about voter suppression. When we have asked about it in the past, it's honestly not been a huge issue. Even among Democrats, it's not necessarily a top tier concern, even though I do think that it is something like, that is a topic of concern, probably much more of a topic of concern than voter fraud, which doesn't really happen. But no, we've not asked about that recently. What are the implications for the future elections if many election deniers end up winning their midterm races? I don't know if I can necessarily speak to that in terms of like how well the system will hold or anything like that. What I can speak to, though, is that there has been a long-term decline in Americans' trust in the government and trust in sort of institutions writ large. And people winning that are then just going to sort of try to tear stuff apart is just going to feed into that trend, I think. And honestly, that's a trend that's sort of hard to reverse anyways. So sort of election deniers, people who are saying that Biden is not the legitimate president, that Trump legitimately won, things like that, which are all untrue, is just going to add to that decline, that sort of, loss of confidence. And what we have right now is essentially, the majority of Democrats still trust the system and a minority of Republicans. And if a lot of these election deniers win, we'll probably see the Democrats come down, but we're not necessarily going to see the Republicans go back up a lot, right? Like once you lose trust, it's hard to go back up. So it's essentially levels keep getting brought down, and it's definitely something to be worried about writ large, but doesn't seem to be something that's necessarily mobilizing Democrats any more than just like the more general Republicans are scary kind of messaging, which again, we saw in the political extremism, that is one of the #1 issues for Democrats. All right, any other questions? I don't see any others on the pop-up list. So unless someone else has something to throw in here in the next minute or so, appreciate your time joining me today. Thank you for taking the time out for our Inside Track webinar. We will be returning after the election on November 22nd, just before Thanksgiving holiday, for our sort of post-election recap. So please join us then. Otherwise, have a great day. Thank you, and we'll be in touch shortly. Be good.